Welcome, everyone, to the panel on embedding diversity and fairness into model governance. My name is Sean. I'll be your MC for this talk, and beside me we got three wonderful panelists, and also their wonderful faces in the slide behind me. I'll start off by introducing the person to the right of me. Andrea Olgiati is the chief engineer for Amazon SageMaker, AWS ML platform in the cloud. He oversees all development technologies in the areas of deep learning, ML infrastructure, and governance. Sitting beside him is Arthur Barrell. He is the head of data science at RBC. His charter is to research, guide, and deliver data science capabilities, including location intelligence, new data content, AI, ontology, and climate change studies across all departments of the bank. And last but not least, there's Kathryn Hume. She is the VP of Digital Investments Technology at RBC, where she leads a team of software engineers building platforms for advice-driven and self-directed investing. Please join me in welcoming these panelists with a round of applause.
Thank you, Sean. Hi, folks. Have we had lunch? Have we been fed? Are we a bit sleepy? Let's try and make this a conversation. We'll try and connect as much as we can. If you have any questions, we'll do Q&A at the end, but as we go, if you have questions, raise your hand or go to the mic and we'll talk, we'll make it a conversation. Is that okay? Yep. Show me you're awake, wave. Thank you. Okay, so as I said, my name is Andrea. I'll trying to be leading us in this conversation about the past and the present and the future of MLOps. And with me, I have Kathryn and Arthur with the Royal Bank of Canada. And as we were preparing for this, we were talking about kind of where we come from and what the past of MLOps has been and where we are today. It's a specialty, it's a part of MLOps that's growing bigger and bigger. And where folks like RBC are and what the challenges are and what the challenges that you have. And maybe there's something that matches what they say, maybe there's some differences. And then where you folks who have been looking at this for quite some time with a lot of depth see us going. So again, three sections, past, present, future. And I'm going to be asking you questions and take it away. So maybe talking about the past. So ML has changed over the past few years, and the attitude that folks have towards MLOps has changed significantly. Why don't you tell us where you were in terms of MLOps 4 years ago, 5 years ago, and where are you now? I don't know who wants to take it. Maybe Kathryn?
Yeah, sure. Can I just ask in the audience, so who comes from sort of a place like RBC, so large traditional enterprise innovating? Who comes from a startup? Okay. Who comes from like big tech, like Google, Amazon? Okay, so we have kind of across the board. So gosh, I remember I first started thinking about machine learning ops and machine learning governance in 2015-ish, I would say. At the time, I was working for a startup that worked with the RBCs of the world based out of New York City. So we worked with banks like JPMC, Goldman Sachs. I worked with like Viacom Media, et cetera. And at the time, this was like, and there's similar parallels at RBC. Companies had a lot of data scientists. And RBC's been using models since like the 1970s and 80s. But the techniques were traditional statistical modeling. They'd have regression models in place. And we've used models at RBC since that time to do things like credit adjudication. So should we give somebody a loan? If so, for how much? What's the risk that they're going to default on that loan? If they haven't paid their credit card bill in the last couple of months, who should we call first, right, in the collections domain? So there's all sorts of either risk-oriented decisions that would use data that we had about customers and third-party data to make, to make judgment calls on what we should do, as well as optimization of some sort of processes. So what I see internally is that, if I look back, I joined the company in 2019, but even then, there's been governance processes in place for a really long time where there's teams, there are auditors, we have like a third-party audit group within the bank, and they have processes that have been refined year over year to ensure that the models, we can reproduce the results, but all of their techniques were developed for handcrafted features. So they know how to go in and assess the weights that are affiliated with a particular feature, understand what data sets were used. They tended to, and still often tend to, revalidate a model on a 5-year-ish basis because it's an onerous process with tons of documentation, with a lot of time spent. And that 5-year process assumes that the model is not going to change over time. So the weights stay static, and then they come in, and if there's ever any change to the input feature set or the weights, they'd have to revalidate the model. So I remember in early 2019, I was leading a group called Borealis AI at the time, which is a machine learning shop at RBC. And we put in sort of a deep net model that we intended to retrain. It wasn't online learning, it was like monthly batch retraining. But if we did that, we'd have to revalidate the model every month, not using an automated machine, but using humans coming in and doing a handcrafted like feature analysis process. So if I think back a couple of years, super manual. There were certainly a lot of governance techniques, and the fundamental questions asked around reproducibility of results and sort of performance, and even bias to a certain extent, they were there, but there was just no real way to handle this at scale. So yeah, that's a little bit, pass it off to Arthur.
Yeah, thanks.
Similar observations.
Yeah, there's one stage in the process that we probably should highlight that we've certainly been through, and I suspect you've either encountered or you will do, as the progression of recognition that we actually needed an MLOps capability in an organization the size of RBC. It's 85,000 people, and somewhere in the vicinity of 10,000 of those are technologists of some description. What inevitably happened was that each of the organizations realized that they had to do something about the automation of the MLOps process and did it because they needed it right then. So we're now in the stage where we've got multiple of these MLOps deployments, and we've got models that progress through each one of those, and now we're saying, oh, well, wait a minute, everybody needs the same tool. We probably should attempt some kind of convergence here. So the convergence is well underway. But I think that's probably a stage in our past that if we'd thought about it, we probably could have avoided that stage. But the recognition that it came a bit too late.
Yeah, and I have similar experience. I work for SageMaker. We empower companies and startups to large enterprises and startups to run their own ML. And everybody focuses these days on large models, billion parameters, a trillion. Anybody works on billion parameter models?
Only the big tech folks.
Only the big tech. No, also there's a lot of startups that they are invested in. They're making large NLP models their product. And everybody focuses on the size of each model. But what we've seen is that also the number of models has grown a lot, from a handful to a large number. Maybe you can tell us kind of what the numbers look like at a large enterprise, what they used to look like, and what they look like at a large enterprise like RBC.
Yeah, there's a backdrop to that. I think it's about 3 years ago we did a study at RBC actually searching through the processes that RBC uses to process stuff and looking for models. And we didn't qualify them as necessarily AI models or location models or anything. We just said, okay, there's some kind of modeling process that gets executed in the flow. And we came back and said it's in the vicinity of 250,000 models in the day-to-day running of the bank, which sort of set us back on our heels. And that count right now, there's now a mounting percentage of that count which are now proper machine learning models, or at least advanced models in some description. So
The vast majority are still trees.
Yeah.
Things like trees.
Maybe we can hear from you folks. Do you run models in production? If so, how many? Do you run 1, 10, 100, 1 million? Shout it out. 1,000? Okay. Anybody? Are the numbers that we see here? 50. Anybody else? 10. 10. And is that number growing? Do you see, is like what's it going to look like in a year? Just shout it out. What do you think? 11.
He's up the bid.
11.
Since our gentleman in red here answered, we've added one.
So, but the point is, these folks, from what I see, serving large number of customers of all sizes, are at the top of the curve. But the trend continues, right? Everybody says, okay, I had 10 models a year ago, now I have 50, now I have 100. And I think we all need to get prepared for that to change. And with that, I think there's a need, we all feel the need to control our models. And what that has changed is the fact that prior, an individual person could look after a model. And you could have one model per person, one person per model. Now that you have 50,000, 100,000, 1 million, you cannot hire 1 million people to look after a model each, right? So I think that is one of the vectors that I see. And
I can add a complicating factor to that, Andrea. That something to think a little bit about is how many of these models cooperate. How many of them are running independently? How many of them are cooperating? Once you have cooperating models, the degree of complexity escalates and the need for MLOps increases. Something to think about.
Yes. So we talked about the growth in models. And another vector that I think we should be talking about that kind of brings us to the present is the fact that now AI is everywhere. It used to be like that a few years ago, but now this is becoming prevalent. And ML makes real decisions that have real impact on the lives of real people. And there's a great responsibility that comes with it. And being able to understand and deal with the complexity and deal with the decisions that are made at great scale, right? Loan, healthcare. Who has disease X, who does not? How can we make sure that these models don't run out of control? Can we, maybe, you're in a regulated industry, right? Finance. Severely regulated. There's healthcare, there's other industries that are in the same place. What are the forces that you see coming towards it? You want to do this, you want to be responsible, but what is coming, what in the world around you? Maybe Kathryn, you can start.
Yeah, sure. So finance regulated. So obviously there's regulations. OSFI, if anybody's heard of it, I don't know what OSFI stands for, but it's what the acronym stands for, but this is for Canadian-based companies. It's basically the primary financial regulator. There's a couple of things like IROC, CRA, et cetera. So some of the regulatory agencies are collapsing, which leads to, if we have, for example, at RBC, we have a retail business, which is like serves individual customers like you and me. We have wealth management, that serves individual customers who are richer than you and me. And then we have like our institutional banking, which serves companies. So those used to be very separate. So when we thought about what we need to in each system to comply with the regulations, there'd be sort of partitioned work. Some of these regulatory bodies are collapsing. So that has impacts on how we think about our system governance because, things will be unified and we have to bring together the codes. But I think for me, it's still the case that if a company is thinking about machine learning, ethics, bias, governance, et cetera, if a company were only follow the letter of the law and the regulation, that's not enough, right? Because the practices and the social conscience and various people's awareness of what could go wrong, be that within privacy, be that within a decision like a loan, having biased outcomes across different group demographic sets that the institution serves, be that explainability, which is showing up in emerging legislation, but nobody can define it well, including within our own community. And so, a lot of when you look at, for example, Bill C-11, which wasn't passed in Canada, but they're working on something that would be a corollary bill coming forth in the future. It basically says we don't really know how to explain what explainability means, but some judge will, define this in the future, and common law will set precedent on actual practices that companies need to take. So all of this to say, there's work happening, and I'd say this is definitely the present as well as the past. I've seen this for the last 5-ish years in companies, to have people internally thinking deeply about the ethics of the work that they're doing in building models that goes above and beyond compliance groups interpreting legislation. And I think that will continue to be the case for probably the next 10-ish years, as the policy folks who think about this become increasingly well-versed in some of the issues and then influence the way that gets legislated, codified in legislation. But I think that's definitely still the case.
I could add something to that. The field is at such a velocity at this point that we've found the need to do our own regulatory oversight. And there's several reasons for that, but probably the most important one is that the regulatory bodies themselves are struggling to understand how to monitor the ethical application of the tool, how to fit that into the regulatory structure that they already have. So we are actually in a position where we've been offering advice back to them and saying, these are the important pieces you should really be paying attention to. Inside RBC, there's a risk and reputation operating committee. There's a massive privacy organization right through the whole organization. And all of those feed back into the regulatory bodies as well. So that's a place that the regulatory bodies will welcome input and so far have been quite reasonable about it. What we don't want to do is get regulatory bodies who think that this is all evil and we have to fix something, and they sort of block off the opportunity to use the tool.
That's right. And there's legislation coming in the EU. It's going to be there soon. If you work in regulated industries, you probably have legislation that's either there or coming. Raise your hand if that's the case. Yes, what industry is that? Financial services. Anybody from other industries? Healthcare, maybe. That's a big deal. Yes, what do we have? Healthcare, yes. What's the situation there? Right. One of the things that you just briefly touched upon, Kathryn, is bias. We'll spend a few minutes talking about that. Maybe, Arthur, you can... Why is bias important, and where do we find it, and why should I care about it?
Good one. Go.
Oh, one of you two. Either one of you.
There's a dreadful fear that we've had for a long time that at some point somebody's going to say that RBC was mean to me and didn't give me a mortgage. And that may well have all kinds of reason behind it, but the fundamental explainability of that is a crucial part of the conversation. That bias has to be, an organization of our size, in fact any organization, pretty much has to be pristine in the way that they approach that. And we're not just talking about bias in terms of race, we're talking about age bias, we're talking about regional bias.
Give us an example in which bias could creep in, if you may.
Well, let's start with age, right? There's a mental equation that occurs outside the financial institutions that says that older people are more reliable for mortgages, which patently is not true, but it's an understanding of bias. And if it's seen to be that the financial institutions are venturing down the path of changing their loan granting, and if it's perceived that way, then you've got a fundamental problem, and that bias just has to be not there.
And the way I see it, there can be bias in kind of, broadly speaking, two places. One is the data that you use to train a model, and then two is the model as put into production.
Yeah, probably time for me to raise my favorite question there. I don't know if folks here are particularly familiar with geodemographic studies, but it's possible with Stats Canada data and supplemental data to understand the ethnic makeup of various regions of Canada. And these are legitimate understandings. So it may well be that there's a large number of people from Pakistan have settled in this area. So that you've got a dominant language in the area, you've got a dominant ethnic background in the area. That's entirely legitimate and reasonable, and it should be a part of our understanding of Canada. The problem with it, of course, is that if you build that now into machine learning models, if the models are paying attention to that geodemographic data, that bias continues into the model. And if you have, as we do, a pipeline, an MLOps pipeline, and compulsory testing at the end of the pipeline to make sure that you have not transgressed any of the bias rules, the model's going to get rejected. So the quandary that I always wrestle with is, how do you resolve that easily? And if anybody here has a good answer for it, I'm totally all ears.
I don't know, I find this one a hard one to solve with MLOps tools. So like, the sort of standard adage you'll hear with high-level comments on bias in ML is if the input data is biased, you have a smaller set of data points for some certain minority population, then the accuracy of your classifier, say if it's a classification task, might not be as high, or it might be skewed on one subset of the population versus another. But I think if it's that, there's a notion of statistical parity that one can do tests on to test for things like group fairness. So it does the classification balance on a subgroup match the demographic balance in the broader statistical set of the data that you're working with, right? So you can do tests like that. Individual fairness being a slightly different concept, which we can talk about later on. But for me, bias also creeps in other ways that have to do with not the training data as just the data set, but the way in which the labels can be generated. And there, I don't quite know how MLOps can solve it. So think about sort of the standard use cases we see. There was the one in 2018, I think, was when Amazon, sorry, Andrea, was in the news for trying to use a classifier to automate hiring decisions. And so it was like, labels are good candidate, bad candidate, right? And their training data set was past decisions that they made in hiring people for certain functions within the company. And if it so happened that historically you've hired people of a certain type, right? So classic example, and I don't even know if it's the case, but I assume it's white educated males to be on your engineering team, then the system's going to learn to accurately classify according to the decisions the company has made historically, which is not a machine learning problem. It's the inheritance of past decisions, critically accepted within the model. You can also think about subjective labels like classifying whether or not something is hate speech. So here it could be, I think this is hate speech, but Arthur doesn't think it's hate speech. And again, it has nothing to do quite with the model. It has to do with the data generating process and the selection of labels that we add. So I think those are all viable types of bias, and I don't think there's really yet a great technical solution for that besides more of an ethical solution for the developers of model to be asking those questions. Should we be using this in this use case, right? Is it okay? And thinking through that at the beginning of the model dev process as opposed to sort of using tools in an automation pipeline.
Good job.
Thank you. And I, generally speaking, the notion that bias is something that I have to worry about, you have to worry about, is something that I think we accept. But I don't know that the folks who are following you have still made that connection. I don't know if that still has, if that has clicked yet for the people who are not as far ahead as you are. Yeah. So maybe we can ask the folks here. Yeah. Do you worry about bias? Is it something that what do you do about it? Maybe you can come to the mic. Ooh.
So I wanted to ask you about unknown bias. So I work in healthcare, and sometimes.
So can you step up to the mic, and we'll ask our folks.
They'll turn it on for you.
Okay. So I work in the healthcare sector, and sometimes we talk to clinicians very late in the production stage, and they're like, "Oh, did you know that older patients over the age of 90 just don't want chemo at that age because they're quite happy to live their days out, and they just don't want to go through the pain of chemotherapy." So that's something maybe we didn't know, but the experts in that field know. Do you have someone in place in the company to help you identify those biases very early on? How do you deal with those kind of biases and try to avoid those biases coming up in the future? There's certainly biases that we don't know about today but will pop up 10 years later. How do you avoid your models overfitting to those biases?
Yeah, good question. You want to tackle it?
In terms of people in the company, so I've really enjoyed some of the evolution at RBC over the past couple of years, where the risk group, so like again, they're sort of like in banking we call it the first, second, third line of defense, and it's basically the people who build it, the people who check that they built it okay, and the people that check that the checkers are checking it okay, right? So it's like, the watchers of the watchers. These people used to come in very much towards the end of the model development process. So it'd be like the data scientists do their work, and then before they can actually put something into production, there'd be like, yes, does it do this, that, and the next thing? One of the great evolutions has been, and it's still a work in progress, but getting those people up front, right? So more in the design phase of the product development lifecycle. What's the use case? What's the ROI? Some of the questions that a technical team would work together with business on. Like risk will be embedded there to start to ask those questions. I think another one is education. So to include, ethics classes as training for data scientists, for engineers, so they start to think about this. But that's another one where like, I don't know a great solution to that, because if it becomes your required ethics course, like people are gonna be like, all right, I gotta do this, but I don't really care. So it's kind of finding the right approach to making it sink in so people have more awareness of it.
Does it help? And one of the things that I see is the emergence of the model risk officer. You folks have maybe had
We've had it for a long
30
time,
years.
yeah.
Other companies are catching up, and
Well, actually, it's more than that. It's multidimensional. It's not just an individual group. There are multiple groups that it has to go through.
again, you are the top of the top of the top of the sophistication, right? I'm trying to kind of see how others may join you.
He's just
there.
being nice to us.
But one of the things that is becoming more popular now is model cards. And model cards is, here's a document where I can write you mentioned the purpose of a model. Why is it to be, what is it to be used for? Where are the boundaries of its use? Can I use it for this application? For instance, it's a loan risk model, and it's to be done for this particular range of loans as opposed to this one. And maybe we can talk. I'd be interested to hear also from folks in the audience. Like, is this helpful? Is this something that you care about? How does this paper trail? Not quite a paper trail, but how do these tools help you? How can they help the officers, the people who try and make decisions?
I think you can isolate it to checkpoints. You don't necessarily have to have the mass that RBC has, where there's a group for just about everything. As long as you've got the checkpoints in there, even a small organization can go through those checkpoints. And I'll pick an example out of the air. We've just finished preparation of the RBC booth at Collision. I don't know if you folks are planning to go to Collision. It's about 10 days off now. It's a massive conference with something in the order of 35,000 people go through the conference. So it's not a small conference. And we have a display there that is actually using a model. So to get that up there, we went through a progression of steps, and I won't bore you with all the steps, but there were checkpoints for legal, there were checkpoints for privacy, there were checkpoints for whether there's any geographic bias being illustrated in the display, there were checkpoints for risk and reputation, there were and so on and so forth. If you have those checkpoints, it could be instantiated in an individual, but those checkpoints still need to be there, because at the other end, actually we should weave in what Kathryn was saying there as well, that this was a progression, and it was an engagement progression right from the very part where I wrote the description of the original idea, and there was that was a part of the journey.
Yeah, on model cards, so I think it depends on sort of what industry you're in. For us at RBC, we have to do like a model Bible, right? It's like a lot of documentation, once a model goes live. But if you're in a startup and you haven't really thought formally about the documentation on your work, I kind of view a model card kind of the ML equivalent of what would be documentation for full stack eng product, with a slightly different set of questions. The first time this concept came up was, I think, in a Meg Mitchell and co-authors 2018 paper. That paper has an example of a model card with what you might want to put in. I think that's a great resource to start with, just to give you an idea on, it would be like when you first launched the model in production, what the purpose is for, various questions and considerations you have on ethics, what your performance in your training data, your performance on your test data, what you did to validate. So it's got just sort of this framework, and then you could build on it, right? You don't need to follow exactly what they have in there, but it could get you started as a resource.
Does anybody here use model cards? Tell us. Yeah, why don't you step up to the mic?
I come from a startup called Armilla AI. We solve these kind of problems, so it's a shameless plug, if I may. But at the same time, the problem with sort of the model cards or even humans actually determining where you want to look for bias, you have to have a priori knowledge, right, of, okay, these are the things we're looking for. The problem with machine learning is the data sets are so vast, the number of labels and features are so vast, and there's sub-regions within the data, even within a feature, that, to your question, that's where the bias exists. So if you're going in and saying, well, I'm going to look for age bias or gender bias or geographic bias, whatever the case may be, you still are only looking for what you know. And the issue still remains is the hidden biases, which even if you look at gender, there may be sub-regions which are a combination or a correlation between all these features in a sub-region where you might have a bias. The only way to solve for that is where I think model cards and even a human-level effort to understand bias will fail. We need to have automation to discover these things. Again, shameless plug, that's what we do, but that's part of the solution is what I think, which is automation.
Absolutely, and these data sets are way too vast for a human to understand, and they're way too complicated. And the number of steps that you go from the raw data to the features that you use to train a model, it's just so overwhelmingly complex that you cannot do that. We have to invest in tooling, and there's companies that try and build this. We SageMaker try and give you some tooling for that too. But that is absolutely true. Anybody have any other experience that they want to share? Why don't you step up to the mic? 4 minutes.
Hi. So I work for AWS in the AI specialist essay, so it's nice meeting everyone over here.
Can you speak up, please?
Yeah. So, you touched upon the hidden bias, but now I was thinking while we were talking about the accessibility stuff, right? Which is becoming very important with my customers that I've worked with. So how, things that we know we can identify, even with automation, we can only automate what we know. And when we have accessibility requirements and the tests that we want our applications to run with, how do we incorporate those within the model or the MLOps world, talking about not just the guidelines provided currently or we know about, but also in terms of how we can make it easier for people and think about it. So for example, when we go for an interview to any company, most of the companies I would say, there is a question that is being asked for those accessibility stuff, right? But when we are going out for a conference, hardly any requirements are there. So it's limited. So the point is there a way, or have you thought about, incorporating accessibility when it comes into the models, especially with the financial institutions?
Let me pick on that as an example of gap. So in general, we should think about an organization as having an ethical profile across the whole organization. And banks are no different from any other organization. We have regions that we're extremely good at monitoring risk, understanding the risk, understanding that particular facet of the ethical fabric of the organization. But the bit that we need to pay attention to, and I don't think anybody's immune from this, are the little gaps, the places that we haven't done an appropriate oversight of. So it's not a very good answer to your question, but I think it's a great example of the gaps that we worry about.
And Sean is getting dangerously close.
He's creeping up on us.
1 minute. I think that's all we have time for. We didn't get to talk about the future. You're going to hang around for a few minutes. We can have a conversation, but join me in thanking Kathryn and Arthur.